When my husband walked into that delivery room and saw what his decision had done to me, he dropped to his knees right there on the linoleum floor. Not from remorse, not yet anyway, from pure shock. Because Dr. Garrett Holloway, OB on duty, my husband of 3 years, had spent the last 9 hours teaching me a lesson, and what he saw when he finally walked through that door told him, in no uncertain terms, that the lesson had gone very, very wrong. But I need to back up, because none of this makes sense without understanding the world I was living in before that night, the world I'd built inside a small town called Millhaven, Tennessee, population just under 6,000, where everybody knew your name, and half of them knew your business before you did. I'm Darlene. I'm 51 years old. I wait tables at a diner called Patsy's, which sits on the corner of Route 9 and Cedar Street and smells permanently of coffee grounds and bacon grease, and I love it. I've worked there since I was 19 years old, through a first marriage that fell apart, through raising my daughter Cassie mostly on my own, through bad winters and good summers, and every ordinary Tuesday in between. I'm not ashamed of what I do. I'm good at it. I can carry 4 plates on one arm and remember a Six Top's entire order without writing a single thing down. And I know which regulars take their pie warm and which ones want it straight from the fridge. That diner is mine in every way that matters, even though my name isn't on the deed. Garrett came into Patsy's on one of those first warm days of April, 3.5 years ago now. Not quite spring, not quite not. The kind of day where you keep your jacket on in the morning and carry it over your arm by noon. He sat at the counter, ordered black coffee and the veggie omelet, and left a $20 tip on a $9 meal. I noticed. You always notice. He came back the next day, and the day after that. By the second week, he was asking for my section specifically, and by the end of that month, we were having dinner at Rosario's over on 5th, which is as fancy as Millhaven gets. White tablecloths, a wine list, candles in little amber jars. I want to be honest with you. I knew the gap. Garrett was 44, a practicing OB-GYN with privileges at Millhaven Regional and a house on Sycamore Drive with a 2-car garage. I was 48, a waitress with a paid-off 12-year-old Civic and a 2-bedroom apartment above the hardware store. I told him on our 3rd date, straight-faced, that I didn't know what he was looking for, but if it was uncomplicated, I was probably the wrong choice. He laughed and said complicated was the only thing that had ever interested him. I believed him. Lord help me, I believed him. We got married the following January, small ceremony at the county courthouse, dinner after at Patsy's because I wanted it there, and Garrett said that was the most romantic thing he'd ever heard. Cassie stood up with me. She was 26 by then, living 40 minutes away in Clarksville, working at an insurance agency. She hugged Garrett at the reception and told him, quietly but not quietly enough, that she had a very good memory and she'd be watching. He laughed again. He laughed easily back then. The first year was genuinely good. I want to say that clearly because I think sometimes when we look back at something that ended badly, we sand all the good parts away until the whole thing looks like it was always rotten. It wasn't. Garrett was attentive and funny, and he'd come into Patsy's on his lunch break and sit at the counter and eat pie and watch me work and look at me like I was something worth watching. He'd come home to my apartment. We didn't move into his house right away, which I now understand was a choice made on his mother's advice, though I didn't know that at the time. And he'd cook dinner, and we'd sit on the small balcony that overlooked the hardware store parking lot and drink wine and talk until late. My daughter Cassie's little boy, my grandson Theo, had a hamster named Crunch that he'd gotten for his 6th birthday. Theo would bring Crunch along sometimes when Cassie dropped him at our place for the weekend, carrying the little cage like it was a treasure chest, narrating everything Crunch was doing in real time. "Grammy, he's running. Grammy, he stopped. Grammy, I think he's thinking." Garrett was patient with all of it. He'd sit on the floor with Theo and peer into the cage and say very seriously, "You know, I think you're right. He's definitely thinking." I watched him do that once and thought, this is good. This is actually good. We moved into the house on Sycamore Drive in the spring of our first year together. That was when I met Norma. Garrett's mother, Norma Holloway, was 68 years old, lived 12 minutes away in a ranch house she'd shared with Garrett's late father for 35 years, and had, as far as I could tell, organized her entire retirement around the management of her son's life. She was small, barely 5'2", with silver hair cut in a precise bob and fingernails always painted the same shade of pale coral. She looked like someone's sweet grandmother. She was not someone's sweet grandmother. The first time I met her was at a Sunday dinner Garrett arranged at her house, 2 weeks after we'd gotten engaged. She made pot roast and set the table with actual china and was perfectly pleasant the entire evening. She called me "Darlene, dear," and asked about the diner with what seemed like genuine interest, and when I helped clear the plates, she pressed my hand and said she was so glad Garrett had found someone. I drove home that night thinking the warnings I'd heard. Garrett had mentioned once briefly that his mother was a lot, had been overstated. I was wrong. It just took Norma a little while to show me which direction she was pointing. The first thing I noticed was the phone calls. Garrett's phone rang at least once a day from his mother's number, sometimes twice. Long calls, calls he'd take in the other room. I didn't say anything about it for months because I'm not the jealous type, and I figured it was their business. But then I started noticing the calls happened most often after I'd done something Norma didn't like, said something at dinner she disagreed with, or declined one of her invitations because I had a shift at Patsy's, or made a decision about the house without consulting her first. We'd gotten pregnant by the end of our first year of marriage. I know what you're thinking. 50 years old, pregnant? It happens. My doctor told me it was a genuine surprise, a phrase I found both clinically accurate and deeply understated. Garrett was thrilled, openly, genuinely thrilled, which I held on to in the months that followed when things got harder. He kissed my forehead in the doctor's office and said, "I didn't think this was possible," and his voice cracked a little, and I thought, whatever comes next, this is real. What came next was Norma. She arrived at the house the evening after we'd told her, carrying a casserole dish and a list of opinions about prenatal vitamins, and she sat at my kitchen table with the confidence of someone who'd been there much longer than I had and said, "Of course, at her age, you'll want to be very careful." Not to me, to Garrett, like I wasn't in the room. I let it go. It was the first month. I was tired and nauseated, and I didn't have the energy. But Norma had energy to spare. The complaints started small. She'd mentioned to Garrett, never to me, always to Garrett, that I seemed tired at family dinners, that maybe I should cut back my hours at the diner, that it wasn't really appropriate for a woman in my condition to be on her feet all day. Then it escalated to concern about my diet, my sleep, my stress levels, all delivered through Garrett in that particular tone she had, not accusatory, just deeply, relentlessly worried. She was so worried about me, she cared so much. I understood, intellectually, that this was a form of control. I'd been around long enough to recognize it. The question was, what to do about it? And I was still working that out when the pregnancy hit its 7th month, and things inside our house on Sycamore Drive started to shift in ways I couldn't fully see yet. There was a new intern at Millhaven Regional, young woman named Priya. I'd heard the name mentioned a few times, always in passing. Garrett had started coming home later, not dramatically later, 20 minutes, half an hour, just enough that I noticed, just not enough that I said anything, because what was I going to say? You're 30 minutes late? And then there was the evening I called Patsy's to check on a shift swap, and my coworker Tammy answered and said, without thinking, "Oh, Darlene, wasn't that your mother-in-law who was in here earlier? She was talking to Garrett for a long time. I thought that was sweet." I stood in my kitchen with the phone in my hand and stared at the refrigerator. Garrett had told me he'd been at the hospital until 6. Patsy's closed at 5:30. I set the phone down very carefully on the counter. My hands were steady. My hands are always steady. It's one of the things that makes me good at my job. But something in my chest had gone very still, the way the air goes still in Millhaven, right before a bad storm rolls in from the west. That held breath quiet that means something is coming, and you can't yet see exactly what shape it's going to take. I was 33 weeks pregnant. There were 7 weeks left until my due date. And somewhere between the casserole dishes and the phone calls and the 30 minutes that didn't add up, I had the slow, cold, nauseating feeling that I was not the person with the most information about my own life. I heard Garrett's car in the driveway. I heard his key in the lock. I heard him call out, "Hey babe, sorry I'm late, surgery ran over." And I stood very still in the kitchen and waited. And I thought, okay, Darlene, pay attention now. Pay very close attention. He came through the front door with that particular expression he wore when he was trying to look tired instead of guilty. A slight heaviness around the eyes, shoulders rolled forward just a degree too much. I'd seen that expression before. I just never had a name for it until that moment in the kitchen. "Surgery ran over," he said again, because I hadn't responded, and silence made him nervous. "Which surgery?" I asked. My voice came out even. I was proud of that. He blinked. "Marlowe's C-section. I told you about it this morning." "You did," I said. "You said it was scheduled for 2. It ran long." I turned back to the counter and picked up the glass of water I'd been drinking. "Tammy says hi, by the way." A pause. Not a long one, Garrett was quick, but long enough. "Tammy from Patsy's? She mentioned she saw you there this afternoon, with your mother." He didn't answer immediately. I heard him set his bag down on the chair by the door, heard the specific sound of him deciding something. "Mom called and wanted to talk," he said finally. "I stopped in for 20 minutes. I didn't think it was worth mentioning." "No," I said. "I guess you didn't." I didn't push it further that night. I was 33 weeks pregnant, my feet ached, and I had learned somewhere in my 40s that the most important conversations are the ones you have when you're ready, not when you're ambushed. So I filed it away. The gap between 2 o'clock and 5:30, the meeting he hadn't mentioned, the ease with which he offered a half-truth, and I went to bed and lay in the dark and listened to him breathe and thought about all the things I didn't yet know. Over the next 4 weeks, I paid attention the way I pay attention to a difficult table, quietly, completely, without ever letting on that I'm tracking every single thing. I noticed that Priya's name came up more often now, always framed as professional frustration. "She second-guessed me in front of a patient today," he said one evening, stabbing at his pasta. "I don't know what they're teaching these residents." Another time, "She filed a complaint with the department head. Over nothing. She's going to be one of those." He said it the way people say things when they want you to accept a version of events before you have any reason to question it. I also noticed that Norma had started calling the house phone, not just Garrett's cell. She'd never done that before. When I answered, she was always perfectly pleasant. "Oh, Darlene, I was just calling to check on you. How are you feeling? How's the baby?" But there was something underneath it now, a new quality to her pleasantness, like she was measuring something. I was 37 weeks along when my friend Wanda told me what she'd heard. Wanda works the morning shift at Patsy's. She's 62, has hair the color of a copper penny, and has lived in Millhaven her whole life, which means she knows things before most people know there's anything to know. She found me in the break room one Tuesday and sat down across from me and said without preamble, "Honey, I need to tell you something, and I need you not to shoot the messenger." Priya, Dr. Priya Nair, the intern, had filed a formal complaint with the hospital's patient advocate office. The complaint wasn't about anything Priya had done wrong. It was about Garrett. Specifically, it was about a pattern of behavior in the delivery suite: dismissiveness, overrides of nursing recommendations, 2 incidents where Garrett had refused to order a C-section despite documented fetal distress, and 1 incident where he'd told a laboring patient in front of 2 nurses to stop being dramatic. Wanda's sister-in-law was one of those nurses. I sat with that information for a long time. Then I asked Wanda if her sister-in-law would be willing to talk to me. Her name was Denise. She met me at the diner on a Wednesday morning before my shift, and she laid it out plainly. Priya Nair had been raising flags about Garrett's conduct for 2 months. She was methodical about it, documented dates, times, patient identifiers, witness names. Garrett knew she was building a case, and in the last few weeks he had started referring to her, to anyone who would listen, as a problem employee with a grudge. "Your husband has a lot of influence at that hospital," Denise said carefully. He's been there 12 years. She's been there 8 months. People listen to him. What happened to the patients? I asked. The ones where he refused the C-section. Denise looked at her coffee cup. Both delivered vaginally. One had a rough recovery. The other, her baby spent 4 days in the NICU. She paused. I'm not saying the outcomes were his fault directly. I'm saying the decisions made people uncomfortable. I drove home and sat in the driveway for 20 minutes. I was 38 weeks pregnant. My baby was measuring large, 9 pounds, 9.5. My OB had said at my last appointment, which was Garrett himself, which I now understood was its own kind of problem. He'd said it lightly, dismissively, the way he said things he didn't want to linger on. Big baby, but you're built for it, Darlene. Women have been doing this forever. I thought about asking for a C-section. I had not yet asked, because every time I tried to frame the question, I thought about how he'd answer it, and I couldn't figure out how to ask it in a way that didn't sound like an accusation. I was still thinking about that when I went into labor at 39 weeks, 3 days, on a Tuesday night in February. Garrett was at the hospital. He'd gotten a call at 9 p.m. and gone in, and I'd fallen asleep on the couch and woken up at 2 in the morning to a contraction that was not subtle about what it was. I called him. He didn't answer. I called the hospital's main line, and they paged him, and he called back in 11 minutes and told me to come in. His voice, perfectly professional, perfectly calm. What happened over the next 9 hours is something I will carry in my body for the rest of my life. Garrett was the OB on duty. He was my husband and my doctor simultaneously, which is a conflict of interest so obvious that I cannot explain, even now, why I hadn't addressed it months earlier, except that I'd trusted him, and trust is a fog that burns off slowly. He reviewed my chart. He noted the baby's size. He noted that I had a standard pelvis, his word, standard, and he ordered monitoring and told the nurses I was progressing normally. I asked him, in the room, with 2 nurses present, about a C-section. He looked at me, not at my chart, not at the monitor, at me. And I saw something in his face that I hadn't seen before, something tight and deliberate, something that had a history I didn't fully understand yet. You're progressing fine, he said. A C-section is a major surgery. We don't do them electively just because a patient is uncomfortable. I'm not talking about uncomfortable, I said. I'm talking about 9.5 pounds. Estimated weight. Ultrasound estimates have a margin of error. Garrett, I'll check back in an hour. He left. One of the nurses, a woman named Roberta, who had kind eyes and a way of moving through a room that said she'd seen everything twice, came and stood beside me. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she adjusted my monitor and said very quietly, "You can request a second opinion. It's your right. I want you to know that." I looked at her. "Will it do anything?" She held my gaze. "I'll make sure it's documented that you asked." The next 7 hours were the worst of my life. I will not describe them in detail because I don't have words that are accurate enough, and the ones I do have are too raw to put in order. What I will tell you is that my baby weighed 9 pounds, 14 ounces. What I will tell you is that Roberta stayed beside me for almost the entire time, and that at hour 6, she paged the department head, a doctor, Weston, and reported that a patient was requesting a second opinion, and that the on-duty physician was the patient's husband. Dr. Weston arrived at hour 7. He reviewed my chart and my monitors, and looked at Garrett and said, "I'm recommending we move to a C-section." Garrett said flatly, "She's nearly complete. It would be faster to let her deliver." Dr. Weston looked at him for a long moment, and then looked at me and said, "Mrs. Holloway, what do you want?" I said, "I want this baby out safely, however that has to happen." We delivered vaginally. My son was born at 11:47 in the morning. He was healthy. He was enormous. He screamed immediately, which Roberta told me later was the best sound she'd heard all week, and I believe her because it was the best sound I'd ever heard in my life. And then Garrett walked in. He'd been paged once it was over. He came through the door with that practiced expression, the competent physician face, and he looked at me, at what 9 hours and nearly 10 pounds had done to me, and he stopped. And then his knees went, just slightly, just enough that he caught himself on the doorframe. His face went the color of old chalk. "Darlene," he said. "Hi," I said. He didn't speak for a long moment. Then he said, "I didn't know it would." "Yes, you did," I said. Not loudly, not with any particular heat, just clearly. Roberta was still in the room. She didn't look away. Garrett stood in that doorway, and I watched him understand, in real time, that there were witnesses, and that those witnesses had been documenting things all morning, and that Dr. Weston was in the building, and that what had happened in this room over the past 9 hours was not going to stay in this room. I named my son Ellis Raymond, Raymond after my father. He was healthy and loud and had a full head of dark hair and weighed 9 pounds 14 ounces and looked, from the very first minute, like someone who had strong opinions about everything and intended to share them. Cassie drove down from Clarksville that afternoon. She walked into my room, took one look at me, took one look at Garrett sitting in the corner chair, and said to him, very quietly, "Get out." He left without arguing. That, more than anything, told me how much he understood he'd done wrong. What came after was not fast, but it was thorough. Roberta's documentation, combined with Denise's earlier witness accounts and Priya's formal complaint, triggered a formal review by the hospital's Patient Safety Committee. I gave a statement. Dr. Weston gave a statement. 3 nurses gave statements. Garrett was placed on administrative leave while the review was conducted. The process took 4 months, which felt like forever and also exactly as long as it needed to. He did not lose his medical license. I want to be honest about that because I believe in honesty more than I believe in satisfying endings. What he lost was his privileges at Millhaven Regional. The committee issued a formal finding of professional misconduct, specifically, failure to adequately address documented risk factors in a laboring patient, compounded by an undisclosed conflict of interest. He was required to complete a supervised remediation program. His name and the finding were entered into the State Medical Board's public record. Norma called me twice during the review process. Both times I let it go to voicemail. Both times she left messages that were variations on the same theme. Garrett was under so much stress, he'd made a mistake. Surely I understood how complicated things were. The second message ended with her saying, "I just hope you won't make a decision you'll regret." I did not call her back. Garrett and I separated in March, 4 months after Ellis was born. The divorce was filed in May. We worked out a custody arrangement without attorneys, which surprised people who knew us, but it didn't surprise me. Garrett loved Ellis, genuinely and completely, and whatever he'd been willing to risk with me, he wasn't willing to put his son through a war. We split the house on Sycamore Drive. I got half the equity, which I put toward a down payment on a small house on Birch Street, 3 blocks from Patsy's, with a yard and a covered porch and a bedroom for Ellis, and, for the first time in a long time, walls that were entirely mine. Priya Nair stayed at Millhaven Regional. I heard from Denise that she'd been promoted to senior resident.